Admiral Robert Kensington had heard every sea story imaginable during his 32 years in the Navy. Sailors loved their tales, the wilder the better, and Kensington had developed a sixth sense for separating truth from fiction. On November 14, 2018, he sat in the officers' lounge at Naval Base San Diego, nursing his second cup of coffee and reviewing deployment schedules for the Pacific Fleet. The morning sun streamed through the windows overlooking the harbor where destroyers and cruisers sat at anchor like sleeping giants. He was alone, or so he thought, until the door creaked open and an old man shuffled inside. The stranger wore a faded peacoat that had seen better days, probably decades ago, and his weathered face carried the deep lines of someone who'd spent a lifetime squinting into salt spray and wind. Kensington glanced up briefly, assuming the man was lost or looking for the visitors' center, but the stranger made his way directly to the Admiral's table and pulled out a chair without asking permission. The audacity of it made Kensington's eyebrows rise. The old man's eyes were an unsettling pale grey, like storm clouds over open water, and they fixed on the Admiral with uncomfortable intensity. Before Kensington could ask who he was or what he wanted, the stranger spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel rolling in a tin can. He said he needed to tell someone what he'd seen, something that happened 47 years ago, something that had haunted him every single night since. Kensington sighed internally. Another veteran with stories, probably harmless but definitely time-consuming. He had a meeting with the Joint Chiefs in 2 hours and a mountain of paperwork waiting in his office, but something about the old man's demeanor stopped him from dismissing the intrusion outright. There was no swagger in his posture, no gleam of someone eager to spin a yarn for attention. Instead, the stranger looked exhausted, like a man carrying a weight he desperately needed to set down. So Kensington gestured for him to continue, expecting maybe 5 minutes of rambling before he could politely excuse himself. The old man introduced himself as Thomas Beckett, former sonar technician, second class, retired in 19. He'd served on submarines during the Cold War, which immediately caught Kensington's attention despite himself, because submarine service bred a particular kind of sailor, serious men who understood the razor-thin line between life and death under thousands of feet of black water. Beckett leaned forward, his gnarled hands clasped on the table, and began describing an incident from October 1971. He'd been stationed aboard the USS Scorpion, a fast-attack submarine conducting classified surveillance operations in the North Pacific near the Soviet coastline. It was tense work, the kind where one mistake could trigger an international incident or worse, and the crew operated in complete silence for days at a time, listening for enemy vessels and staying invisible themselves. On October 23 at approximately 03:30 hours, Beckett was manning his sonar station during the graveyard watch, when he detected something impossible. At first it appeared as a faint contact about 8,000 yards to starboard, moving at an angle that would bring it across their path. Standard procedure required him to classify and track any contact, so he focused his attention on the signature, running it through the acoustic library in his mind that every sonar tech developed over months of listening to screw sounds and hull resonances. But this signature didn't match anything he'd ever heard. It wasn't Soviet, wasn't American, wasn't any identifiable class of vessel from any navy in the world. The sound was wrong in a way he struggled to articulate even now. Decades later, it was metallic but organic, rhythmic but irregular, and it carried harmonic frequencies that made his teeth ache when he listened too long through the headphones. Beckett reported the contact to the officer of the deck, describing it as an unknown surface vessel bearing 090 range closing. The OOD ordered the submarine to periscope depth for a visual confirmation, a risky move in hostile waters, but necessary given the unusual circumstances. As they rose slowly from the depths, Beckett kept tracking the contact, watching in disbelief as the signature grew stronger and more defined. The closer they got, the more wrong it sounded. When they reached periscope depth, and the captain took his look, there was absolute silence in the control room for what felt like an eternity. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom, tight and controlled in the way officers sound when they're fighting to maintain composure. He described a ship on the surface, a destroyer by its profile, but covered in rust and listing badly to port. Its hull number was partially visible despite the corrosion, and failing light, DD-79. The captain ordered Beckett to cross-reference the number with the registry, which he did immediately, and when the results came back, the temperature in the control room seemed to drop 20 degrees. DD 7098 was the USS Phantom, a Gearing-class destroyer commissioned in 1945, near the end of World War II. According to official records that Beckett pulled from the submarine's reference library, the Phantom had been decommissioned in 1968 and sold for scrap to a breaker yard in Taiwan. The ship should have been cut apart years ago, recycled into rebar and appliances, scattered across a dozen countries as raw steel, but there it was, on the surface, 3 years after it supposedly ceased to exist, drifting in international waters with no lights, no radio traffic, no signs of life aboard. The captain made the decision to surface completely and attempt to hail the vessel, another dangerous choice, but one justified by the absolute strangeness of the situation. As the Scorpion broke through the waves and the lookouts scrambled to the bridge, Beckett could hear their reports filtering down through the boat. The Phantom looked abandoned, maybe for months or years, based on the heavy fouling and rust, but its hull was intact, and it was somehow still afloat, despite the obvious neglect and damage. They tried signaling with lights, got no response. They attempted radio contact on every frequency, heard only static. The captain considered sending a boarding party but ultimately decided against it, because the destroyer was clearly unseaworthy and might sink under them at any moment, and because something about the whole scene felt fundamentally wrong in a way that decades of naval experience told him to avoid. Instead, the Scorpion circled the Phantom twice, documenting everything with the periscope cameras and standard reconnaissance procedures, and then the captain made the call to dive and return to their original mission. But before they descended, Beckett took one last look at his sonar display and noticed something that made his blood run cold. The Phantom's acoustic signature had changed. It was no longer drifting passively with the current but was maintaining a steady heading, which meant someone or something aboard was operating the vessel's propulsion system, despite no visible signs of crew, no lights, no responses to their hails. The destroyer's screws were turning, barely, just enough to hold course, and as the Scorpion prepared to dive, the Phantom turned gradually to starboard and continued on its way into the darkness, disappearing into the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, like it had never been there at all. Admiral Kensington had stopped reviewing his paperwork. His coffee sat forgotten and cooling while Beckett continued his account in that rough, exhausted voice. The old man explained how the Scorpion returned to base 3 weeks later, and the captain immediately filed a classified incident report, detailing their encounter with the impossible vessel. Beckett himself was debriefed separately by naval intelligence officers who asked the same questions over and over, clearly trying to poke holes in his story or catch him in a lie, but his account never wavered because it was the truth exactly as he'd experienced it. The intelligence officers took his sonar recordings, confiscated the periscope footage, and told him in no uncertain terms that he was never to discuss the incident with anyone, not his family, not his shipmates, not even his priest. They classified the entire event at a level so high that Beckett wasn't even allowed to know the classification designation, and they transferred him off the Scorpion within a month to a desk job in Norfolk where he couldn't talk to his former crew. He spent the next 4 years pushing papers and trying to forget what he'd seen, but you don't forget something like that, not ever. When he retired in 1975, he assumed the story would die with him, just another secret buried in the Navy's endless archives of classified oddities and unexplained phenomena. Kensington listened to all of this with growing discomfort because the old man's details were too specific, too consistent with actual submarine operations to be pure fabrication. Beckett knew the correct terminology, the proper procedures, the small details that only someone who'd actually served on boats would know, but the story itself was insane. Ships don't come back from the scrapyard, crews don't vanish from functional vessels, and acoustic signatures don't behave the way Beckett described. The Admiral found himself in the uncomfortable position of believing the man was telling the truth about his experience while simultaneously knowing the experience itself was impossible. So Kensington did what he always did when confronted with the inexplicable. He started asking practical questions. He wanted to know if anyone else from the Scorpion had come forward with similar accounts, if there were other documented sightings of the Phantom, if any follow-up investigations had been conducted. Beckett shook his head slowly and explained that most of his old crew were dead now, taken by time and old age, and the few survivors he'd managed to track down refused to discuss that patrol at all, some hanging up immediately when he mentioned October 9. The Admiral sat back in his chair and studied the old man carefully, looking for tells that might indicate delusion or dishonesty. Beckett's hands were steady despite his age, his eyes clear and focused, his posture upright. This wasn't someone in the grip of dementia or caught in the fog of false memory. Whatever he'd experienced aboard the Scorpion, he believed it absolutely, and that belief had weight. Kensington made a decision then that he'd later question many times. He pulled out his phone and opened the Naval Archives database, entering his access codes that granted him privileges most officers would never see, and he searched for records of the USS Phantom. What came back made him go very still. The official record matched what Beckett had described. DD 798, commissioned in 1945, served through the end of World War II and into the Cold War, decommissioned in 1968, sold for scrap to Taiwan. Standard career for a destroyer of that era, nothing remarkable about it at all, but Kensington had high-level access that let him see more than just the public records, and when he dug deeper into the classified files, he found something that shouldn't have been there, a series of incident reports spanning from 1969 to 1973, all marked with the same cryptic classification code, all describing brief encounters with an unidentified destroyer matching the Phantom's description and hull number. A frigate reported passing it in the South China Sea in 1969, dead in the water but showing no distress signals. A merchant vessel claimed to have been shadowed by it near the Philippines in 1970, maintaining a parallel course for 6 hours before disappearing in broad daylight. A Coast Guard cutter nearly collided with it off the coast of California in 1972, reporting that the ship appeared suddenly in heavy fog and vanished just as quickly when the weather cleared. Each report had been investigated, found inconclusive, and quietly filed away in the darkest corners of the archive where nobody thought to look unless they were specifically searching. The last documented sighting was in November 1973, after which the Phantom apparently vanished for good, swallowed by the ocean or whatever strange fate had claimed it. Kensington showed the reports to Beckett, and the old man's face showed recognition and something else, vindication maybe, or relief that he hadn't been carrying this burden alone all these years. But there was more. Kensington kept digging through the files and found something that made his stomach turn, a memorandum from 1974, authored by a rear admiral whose name had been redacted, recommending that all records related to the Phantom be purged from the archives and that no further investigations be conducted into reported sightings. The memorandum's reasoning was chilling in its bureaucratic coldness. It stated that continued investigation of the phenomenon served no strategic purpose, consumed resources better allocated elsewhere, and risked exposing classified operations if the inquiries attracted unwanted attention. More disturbing was the final paragraph, which suggested that the Phantom incidents might be connected to experimental propulsion technologies being tested during the late 1960s, technologies that had been abandoned due to unforeseen complications. The memo didn't specify what those technologies were or what complications had occurred, but the implication was clear enough. Someone high up in the Navy's chain of command knew more about the Phantom than they were willing to commit to writing, and they wanted the whole thing forgotten. Kensington felt his worldview shifting uncomfortably. He'd spent his entire career in an environment that valued order, procedure, and rational explanations. The Navy was built on predictability and understood principles. Ships followed the laws of physics, crews followed orders, and mysteries got solved through proper investigation and application of expertise. But here was evidence of something that violated those comfortable certainties, something that the institution itself had chosen to suppress rather than explain. He looked at Beckett again and saw the question in the old man's eyes, the plea for someone in authority to finally acknowledge that what he'd witnessed was real and significant. Kensington made another decision then, probably the most consequential of his career. He told Beckett to wait while he made some calls. The Admiral stepped out of the lounge and walked to his office, closing the door behind him, and standing at the window overlooking the harbor, he pulled out his secure phone and dialed a number he'd only used twice before, a direct line to the Office of Naval Intelligence that bypassed normal channels and connected him to people who handled sensitive situations that couldn't go through regular procedures. When someone answered, Kensington identified himself, and requested immediate access to all files related to experimental naval technologies tested between 1965 and 1975, specifically anything involving destroyer-class vessels or propulsion systems. There was a long pause on the other end, then questions about why he needed this information and what investigation he was conducting. Kensington explained about Beckett's account and the incident reports he'd found, and another longer pause followed. Finally, the voice on the phone told him that someone would be in touch within the hour, and that he should not discuss this matter with anyone else in the meantime. The line went dead, and Kensington stood there wondering if he'd just made a catastrophic mistake, or finally done something important after 3 decades of routine decisions and paperwork. When Kensington returned to the lounge, Beckett was still sitting exactly where he'd left him, staring out the window at the ships in harbor with an expression of profound exhaustion. The Admiral sat down across from him again and said that he'd made some inquiries, that people would be looking into this, that after 47 years the old man's story would finally get the attention it deserved. Beckett nodded slowly but didn't look reassured. He said he'd been hoping for validation, for someone to tell him he wasn't crazy, but now that it was happening, he felt afraid of what they might find. Some truths are comfortable and some aren't, and the Phantom fell firmly into the latter category. They sat in silence for a few minutes, 2 men from different generations bound together by a story that neither of them fully understood. Then Beckett reached into his peacoat and pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age and creased from years of being carried around. He slid it across the table to Kensington. The photo showed a young sailor in dress blues standing on a dock, the ocean stretching behind him to the horizon. The sailor was smiling, maybe 22 or 23 years old, his whole career ahead of him. Beckett tapped the photo with one gnarled finger and said that was him in 1971, taken a week before the Scorpion's patrol that would change everything. He wanted Kensington to have it, to remember that the people involved in these classified incidents and buried reports were real, with names and faces and lives that got tangled up in things beyond their control. Before the Admiral could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Onai, asking him to report immediately to a secure facility in Coronado for a briefing on the matter he'd inquired about. The message included coordinates and access codes, and it emphasized that he was to come alone and tell no one where he was going. Kensington showed the message to Beckett and said this was it. They were taking it seriously, which should have felt like a victory but instead filled both of them with a creeping sense of dread. The old man stood up slowly, his joints cracking with the effort, and offered his hand. Kensington shook it, feeling the calluses and scars of decades of hard work, and Beckett told him to be careful because some doors stay closed for good reasons. Then the old sailor turned and walked out of the lounge, leaving the Admiral sitting alone with a 47-year-old photograph and a head full of questions that might not have answers anyone wanted to hear. Admiral Kensington drove to Coronado in silence, his mind racing through everything Beckett had told him and everything he'd found in the archives. The secure facility turned out to be a nondescript building set back from the main base, the kind of place that doesn't appear on official maps and doesn't have signs out front. He used the access codes from the message and was met by 2 naval intelligence officers who escorted him to a windowless conference room deep in the building's interior. What followed was 3 hours of the most unsettling briefing he'd ever received. The officers, both commanders whose names they never shared, laid out a history of the Phantom that went far beyond scattered incident reports. In 1967, the destroyer had been selected for a classified program testing an experimental propulsion system designed to make vessels nearly undetectable to sonar. The technology involved manipulating magnetic fields around the hull in ways that distorted acoustic signatures, essentially making the ship a ghost to anyone listening. Initial tests were promising, but during a trial run in early 1968, something went catastrophically wrong. The crew reported severe disorientation and equipment malfunctions, and when the Phantom returned to port, several sailors required hospitalization for symptoms that doctors couldn't explain or treat. The program was immediately shut down, the technology classified at the highest levels, and the decision was made to decommission the destroyer and destroy it completely to prevent the experimental systems from falling into enemy hands. Except the Phantom never made it to Taiwan. The vessel departed under tow in June 1968 and vanished somewhere in the Pacific, the crew of the tugboat reporting that they'd lost their tow line during a storm and the destroyer had simply disappeared into the heavy weather. Search operations found nothing, and eventually the Navy declared the ship lost at sea while maintaining the public story that it had been scrapped. Everything that came after, the sightings, the encounters, Beckett's experience on the Scorpion, all of it suggested that the Phantom was still out there, drifting through the oceans like a ghost, its experimental systems perhaps still active, and warping reality around it in ways nobody understood. The commanders told Kensington that the Navy's official position was that further investigation served no purpose, the ship was lost, the technology was abandoned, and the whole affair was best left buried in classified archives. But they also said off the record that sightings still occurred occasionally, always brief and impossible to verify, and that somewhere in the Pacific depths, the USS Phantom continued its eternal patrol, crewed by shadows and powered by science that should never have been tested. Kensington left the briefing feeling like he'd aged 10 years in 3 hours, and when he returned to his office that evening, he found a note on his desk from Beckett with a phone number and a simple message thanking him for listening and warning him not to look too deep into things that don't want to be found. The Admiral kept the photograph of the young sailor on his desk for the rest of his career, a reminder that some mysteries remain mysteries not because they can't be solved, but because the answers are too strange for comfortable reality.